Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Britain has not been keen on industrial intervention. It's throwing good money after bad, it is said. But that laid-back, laissez-faire approach is meeting its stiffest challenge ever. Are we really willing to do nothing and watch our steel industry fade away? Remember, when Britain let Rover go, when it went under, we already had a new car industry in place, but that's not where we are with steel. Needless to say, arguments for some kind of help are swirling around at the moment. We need a steel industry for defence. We need one for the Welsh valleys. We shouldn't let others steal the market from us by aiding their industry if we don't help ours. And some say it's just a temporary problem, not a permanent one, just a storm to be weathered if we can get it through the next couple of years. Well, we'll test some of these points later on, but the dilemma is stark. Do we give help? And if so, how? Let's start with our policy editor, Chris Cook.
Today's bad news may be all about Port Talbot in South Wales, but you actually have to look further afield to see the whole story of British Steel. Tata Steel itself is based in Mumbai in India. That's where this week's decision was made. But the country with perhaps the biggest impact on the global steel industry is China. And any attempts by the UK government to support British Steel will be subject to review by the European Commission in Brussels. It's a local, global story. Now, steel is an essential material for modern city living. Behind me here is part of the giant Crossrail works. This is built using Tata Steel, in this case from Scunthorpe. The problem isn't with demand so much, it's really with supply. China, once upon a time, imported lots of steel. At the same time, though, it was building a massive domestic steel industry. But between 2012 and 2015, supply beat demand. The price for steel products in China more than halved. So those new Chinese steel producers started to export. You can see Chinese sales abroad zoomed up as domestic prices fell. So in a few short years, China swung from being a voracious customer to fierce competition. This isn't like the problems facing banks in 2008, when we were on the verge of having no big banks left at all. The issue is too many steelmakers in the world. Some argue, though, we should save our steelmakers.
We shouldn't be looking for charity or sentimental reasons for keeping it, but there clearly are some benefits, not for every company, but some benefits for proximity, for being closely integrated into supply chains. So for example, if the car manufacturing base in the northeast is closely integrated into metals manufacturing in the West Midlands, they can really connect and create real comparative advantages there over steel producers in, say, China, which can't react to market demands. And particularly as we go forwards into much more flexible forms of production in the 21st century, having a steel base in the UK could be a real comparative advantage going forwards if we can keep it viable in this really acute short-term moment.
There are also awful human costs to mass unemployment. You can still see the trauma in many former mining towns today, and their experience suggests you can't underestimate the potential fiscal costs either. Andrew Glynn, an eminent left-wing economist, estimated that it would actually have been cheaper to pay the cost of keeping 31 mines open in the 1990s than paying the miners' dole. But Britain just wouldn't be allowed to prop up Port Talbot. Now, it's a founding principle of the European Union that states shouldn't be allowed to tilt the playing field in favour of their own companies, either through putting up barriers to foreign companies' products or by offering them subsidies. Now, that latter rule, the so-called state aid rules, that could get in the way of helping an ailing company like Tata Steel in Britain. There are only limited exceptions to those rules on subsidies.
One of them relates to so-called rescue aid, but is permissible in very tightly defined circumstances and has to be with a view to restoring the business to its long-term health, and it's considered as very much a temporary measure.
Since the European Commission estimates Europe has 10 to 15% too much steelmaking capacity, selling a rescue might be tough. But the EU may be handy cover for Britain. The government is not keen to end up with a loss-making business on its balance sheet.
I don't think that nationalisation is going to be the solution, because I think everyone would want a long-term viable solution. And if you look around Europe and elsewhere, I think nationalisation is verily the answer, particularly if you take into account the big challenges the industry faces. But there are solutions, I think, to this once we understand the situation better, and we want to make sure that we explore all of them.
So, what might ministers do? Well, Britain is against raising Europe-wide tariffs on Chinese steel, noting the pain it would cause to steel buyers. Labour has supported intervention and measures against Chinese steel dumping.
I went to meet the President of China, President Xi, to press on him that very demand. But it seems to me that too many people are not prepared to say to the Chinese government, sorry, your behaviour is not right, not fair, not proper, and certainly not within the rules of the World Trade Organization.
If they're to avoid closing this chapter in British steelmaking history, what options have ministers left themselves then? Well, they could try to cut energy costs, or they could buy more British steel, or they could help finance a sale, but that all still needs someone to take the plant on. The killer question tonight is, who might that be, and what might they save?
Chris Cook there. Well, you can read the history of the European steel industry over the last 50 years or so, and it comes across as one manifest crisis after another. A recession each decade, more or less, excess supply, attempts by European institutions to manage things thwarted by the desire of each country to keep its own plants open at almost any cost. It makes this a peculiarly difficult industry to manage. Well, Sir Vince Cable is with us, Lib Dem and former business secretary in the coalition government. You were trying to manage it here. If you were still in that job, what would you be doing tomorrow?
Well, I think government intervention is involved, whether we like it or not. I mean, we're already intervening by providing compensation because of high energy costs. We got state aid clearance for that during the coalition government. The argument is we could be doing more of that. What we would have to be doing tomorrow, I think, is trying to bridge the very short-term objective which Tata have set for getting out of the industry and the longer period that will be required to manage this sale in an orderly way without catastrophic consequences. And I think the other area we have to look at a bit more closely is the issue of international trade. I'm not a protectionist, but under international trade law, if you do get dumping, selling in foreign markets below domestic prices, which allegedly the Chinese have been doing, I think there's a certain amount of evidence of that, then the European Union is entitled to impose anti-dumping duties. It's done so at relatively low level.
Right. And you could
for some reason the British government voted against the higher tariff regime that they could have gone for. So those are the issues we should be focusing on.
Just to be clear, I mean, you used the word sale, we're using the word sale. This is up for sale, British Steel up for sale. It isn't really up for sale, is it? They would give it away at this point, right? I mean, I think they'd sell it for £1. In fact, might even pay someone to take it off their hands.
Yes, and there aren't a great many buyers around. When the issue about Scunthorpe came up a year ago, we had one guy who expressed an interest, and it was really an asset stripping operation. On the other hand, there has been a sale, what seems to be a bona fide sale, to a buyer in Scotland. Scottish government intervened. I think they nationalised it for a few seconds to enable a back-to-back deal to take place. So, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult environment.
And on that nationalisation, would you support... You're not in favour of long-term nationalisation, no. Would you support a short-term nationalisation, even if it meant the Exchequer was going to be paying about £1 million a week to keep the thing alive?
Well, I approach this in a completely non-doctrinal way. I mean, public ownership has a role in very limited circumstances. I'm not against it in principle if it would help. I don't think actually this is a question of throwing large amounts of taxpayers' money. I mean, a closure, particularly a rapid, disorderly closure, would impose very, very large costs. Not just on the human, there's a human cost and the community cost, but a very large fiscal cost as well. Clearly the government's got to look at value for money. That's one of the requirements of the European Union rules, amongst other things. But if there were value for money in a temporary period of public intervention, then of course we should do it. We did this it wasn't given much publicity, but in the closing stage of the coalition, we had this problem with the last underground coal mines, and some short-term temporary bridging loan finance was provided.
OK, well, hang on there. We're going to pick up some of the strategic questions shortly, because